Hello, Spongy Bible Brains. Welcome to Beach Church Daily Bible Devotion as we read through the Bible each year. Tonight we look at chapters 19, 20, and 21 of the Old Testament book of Job. There are several events and statements in the book of Job that are widely known and acknowledged for their distinctive excellence. This is to say that they are iconic in nature. Everybody who is anybody who has either read the Bible or even read something about the Bible, or had what we used to call a liberal arts education, that is somebody who was well read in the classics of civilization, is aware of the following: the opening scenes of conversation between God and Satan, juxtapositioned with Job's devoted character toward God, his immense wealth in things and in family, and then he loses it all for no good reason. That's the setup. There's one that may not be well known, but it's one of my favorite comments by Job in the book. And it's a bit of sarcasm when Job responds to one of his three friends, Zophar, after Zophar has been imploring Job to repent because his suffering is directly related to his sins. And Job quips, "Well, no doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you." I always like that. And then, of course, the iconic final chapters when God does appear to Job, questions him, and it also includes Job's ultimate humble response to God. But in these three chapters today is another iconic moment, maybe the most iconic due to its obvious messianic nature, and it points directly at New Testament promises that are obviously yet to occur or even to be promised. This occurs in chapter 19, so I'm going to focus on that chapter today. So let's set the stage. Chapters 19 through 21 end what is known as the second cycle of debates between Job and his so-called friends. In chapter 17, Job prays for relief from his suffering. In chapter 18, Bildad launches into another Shakespearean type soliloquy on the fact that the reality of existence for wicked people is that they only experience bad outcomes in their lives, suffering terribly and meeting with disaster. So in chapter 19, Job is desperate at this point. He's at the depth of his despair and suffering. And it's an anguished cry that his friends have become stubborn in their mistaken opinion about the reason for Job's suffering. That is to say, they become lousy friends, and they're misguided, as they have had no effect on his dealing with the sin they imagine is present, although it isn't. In a sense, Job is, through these verses in chapter 19, is saying, if God sends him friends like Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz, who needs enemies? And then Job rehearses his sufferings and says that he should be pitied, since God has caused all of it to occur, and for no apparent reason in Job's mind, that is. And so the conclusion of that part is that Job is barely alive, since he says he escaped death by the skin of his teeth, which happens to be the origin of that saying, by the way. And then in verse 23, it begins to build up toward the iconic statement. Job cries out that he wishes his words could be engraved in stone with an iron pen and lead forever. And then in verses 25 through 27, at the point of Job's greatest despair, his faith appears at the highest. Now remember, Job is suffering terribly in every way possible short of death, which, by the way, he would welcome anyway, to the extent that earlier in the book he wished he had never been born so that he could end up suffering. And all of this he blames on God. He says it. God brought this on me. And this is what he says starting in verse 25. For I know my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Job confidently affirmed God as his Redeemer, and he wanted that confidence in the record for all to know. He wanted the activities of his life to be put into words and inscribed in granite so that all would know that he had not sinned equal to the magnitude of what he was suffering. And get this, God granted his prayer. God was his Redeemer. God would vindicate him in the last day of judgment on the earth when justice was finally done. And you don't need to be a biblical scholar to immediately think of Jesus and these words that were very probably written at a time between the Tower of Babel and God's call to Abram. So this is well before any nation of Israel even existed, or the idea of a suffering servant of God was sprinkled through God's words to his people. And remember, Job is considered by most scholars the oldest book in the Bible. Think about it. Job had no hope left in his life, but he was confident that after he was dead, his Redeemer would vindicate him in the glory of the physical. He says, in my flesh, I will see the Lord. To make you think about a new body that you get when you get to heaven. And in this resurrection, in this new body, he would enjoy perfect fellowship with the Redeemer. That Jesus Christ is that Redeemer is the clear message of the gospel. Now, this section finishes with Zophar's sermon on the wicked man. That's chapter 18. And he's again admonishing Job about the fate of the wicked. Job counters with his own take on the pleasurable, I'm sorry, that was chapter 20, not 18. Job counters that with his own take on the pleasurable experiences of the wicked that he observes. And they're both right. The key point of this last argument is significant because if Job is correct and the wicked do, in fact, experience pleasure and joy and happiness and success, it also means, logically, that the righteous might also experience terrible suffering, even though they have not sinned, which is Job's position. These truths in these 3 chapters, and especially chapter 19, it's a big fat deal. Since Job and his friends didn't know about God's bet with Satan, they're all struggling to explain suffering from the perspective of their ignorance. And so finally, Job just rests in nothing but faith in God's goodness and in the hope of his redemption. So the major reality of the book is this inscrutable, this unknowable mystery of innocent suffering. God ordains that his children walk in sorrow and pain, sometimes because of sin, sometimes because God is chastening them, teaching them a lesson, or even strengthening them, maybe for something coming down the road, or even sometimes God allows suffering so that God's grace can simply be revealed. There are all scriptures that support those ideas. But there are times when the reason for the suffering of the saints is simply unknowable because it's for a heavenly purpose that those on earth cannot discern. So it's kind of weird. If this was all I had to go on to promote to someone becoming a Christian, it might begin with the invitation to come suffer with us and be redeemed. On that biblical note, have a good evening. All right, God bless you.